that the Zoom meeting is being recorded and it will be made available on the district's Engage Muskoka website. So that the folks who can't join today, they still have the opportunity to watch and learn and provide feedback. If you have any feedback to provide, you are welcome to share that at the end of the forthcoming presentation, or you can email me directly. And with that, I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Cassie Ems, and I'm a planner here at the District of Muskoka, and I'm also your point person for the causation studies. So I'd just like to kick off this meeting with a quick background of causation studies, as it's been quite some time since we've all been together. Causation studies are identified in accordance with the Muskoka official plan when a lake experiences one of three water quality indicators, one of which is the occurrence of a blue-green algae bloom. The purpose of causation studies is to identify why the lake experienced the water quality indicator. And in this case, Echo Lake was chosen for the study because of previous algae bloom, and also because it has high development potential, and also because the Lake Association was involved during the Muskoka official plan review and expressed interest in a causation study. There are 4 other causation studies being done concurrently, and while the results of each study will be uniquely and carefully looked at on a lake-by-lake basis, we also have the opportunity to see if there are any trends or patterns about how water quality is being affected across the watershed. The district, the Echo Lake Association, and other stakeholders are key players in this project. And like you all, district staff are looking forward to this presentation to learn about the results and recommendations and how the results can inform our land use or development planning policies. Ultimately, we want to ensure that the outcomes of this study and other concurrent studies can be successfully implemented at the policy and program level. So now let's move on to a quick introduction. If we can hit next slide there, please, Chris. I'd just like to introduce you to the project team. So on the line today, we have Chris Hadley and Beverly Saunders. Dr. Chris Hadley joined Hutchinson Environmental Ltd. As an NSERC Industrial Research and Development Fellow in 2013, after completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the Ontario Ministry of Environment and PhD at Queen's University. Chris has worked on a wide array of projects on lakes in Muskoka, Haliburton region since 2008. Beverly Saunders is the planning supervisor at EcoView Consulting Services. She has 12 years of experience in environmental and land use planning, as well as policy analysis and development. This includes 4 years of leading watershed planning efforts driven by stakeholder concerns, which were identified through workshops, public meetings, surveys, and one-on-one consultation. Beverly currently works on both private and municipal land use planning projects with a focus on leading work which involves stakeholder engagement and environmental impact issues. Beverly has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and a Master's of Science in Aquatic Research with a past research focus on consensus-based watershed planning. Colleagues of mine here at the district that have been involved in the study and who are on the call today include Elizabeth Purcell, Manager of Planning, and Rebecca Wilson, Watershed Planning Technician. And lastly, but most importantly on our project team are the stakeholders. We have relied on the participation of stakeholders throughout the entirety of this project, and that remains true as we approach the final stages of the project. Thank you to all the stakeholders so far, whether you're a Lake Association member or if you live, work, or play on the lake. You have all provided valuable input to help us gain an understanding of the current and past conditions of the lake. So again, thank you for helping us gather information, for your interest in the study, and thank you also in advance for providing your feedback on the forthcoming draft report. So without further ado, Beverly, I turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Cassie. Just before we leave this slide, just for clarification for everyone on the call. So I work for EcoView, as was introduced. Our role within this process is the consultation component. So drafting the survey, working with the scientists to ensure that that public comments have been thought about and reviewed, and also just summarizing how that all happened, and also summarizing the consultation points, which I'll go over in a few minutes. Hutchinson is the science behind all of this, and so they will be doing the bulk of this presentation, Chris specifically, and he'll have the more scientific answers to your questions as well. And the district is here if you have questions that are specific to them that we're unable to answer or were outside of the scope of the study. Next slide, please, Chris. So this is just quick housekeeping. So that right now everyone is muted. That said, there is a chat box at the bottom of your screen for the Zoom call. We are monitoring that throughout the presentation. If you do have questions or things that you would like addressed, feel free to put that in while the presentation is ongoing. Mostly I won't be interrupting, or we won't be interrupting Chris in his presentation to start unless there's some major clarification that's needed, or it seems to make sense based on what he's speaking about. But primarily we'll just have him finish his presentation and for us to present next steps before we'll read those questions. That said, I don't want you to forget the question or anything like that. So please put it there. And if we do think it's something that has to be addressed right away, then I can certainly pipe in. Additionally, if you have just general comments or concerns, so we are keeping track of the chat function, so feel free to put them in there as well. We will be doing a summary of this meeting to proceed. After the presentation, we are going to be opening it up to questions, particularly if you would like to attend or you'd like to ask a question by video or voice. There is a reaction symbol at the bottom of your Zoom screen that has a raise hand function. And so we would request that at the end of the presentation, if you do want to ask a question or provide a comment, to just raise your hand, and then I'll answer them and unmute you in the order that I see those hands go up. Additionally, I will also be monitoring the chat function at that time. And so if you aren't comfortable speaking, but you do want to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the chat box. There will be plenty of time for the question and answer period at the end. So just keep in mind that we'll have lots of time to answer those questions as we go. That said, if you come up with a question later or have any issues of concern that come up later, Cassie's contact information will be at the end of the presentation, and you can always email her directly, and then all of that information is provided to us. Okay, next question, or next slide, please. So today, as I said, Hutchinson and I are both presenting. Mine's primarily just on the progress to date. Majority of the presentation is Chris. And then I'll just briefly go over next steps in terms of the project. And then we'll have the question period at the end. Next slide. So progress to date, we did have a startup meeting at the beginning of the project with the consultants in the district to just plan the project and the consultation process to make sure we were meeting the individual needs of each of the lakes, and in this lake in particular. And then we did receive data and information that was provided on the lake generally. So there was a folder that was provided to us with everything that essentially the district had. So those were considered in the overall project, and all of that information was reviewed, and a data analysis or data gap analysis was completed by Chris, which he'll go over his steps shortly. We had our first stakeholder meeting on April 24th, 2021. That meeting was posted on Engage Muskoka, and it is there for reference. Next slide, please. We subsequently launched a survey, which did inform and which did get submitted as well or a summary got submitted as well on Engage Muskoka and is available for review. The collection and field work occurred in 2021 and 2022, meaning primarily field collection was done in 2021, and then the data collection continued into 2022. That was primary reason for the delays in the assessment, needing to ensure that we had a proper data set for completing analysis. We completed a draft of the causation studies just prior to this meeting, but we're presenting these results now because we would like to summarize comments, make sure that we are considering anything that is brought up in this meeting in the finalization draft report, and that will be posted 1 week from today and open for comment periods for 2 weeks. And I'll go over that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. So right now we're at the second stakeholder meeting. This is the final public meeting of the process. And we're here to discuss the results and to present the overall results as well. Next slide. For project timelines, this was a slide in the original presentation, so I just want to revise it. Originally, so we are about a year later than what was originally proposed, given those data delays. And so we're just updating this to let you know when to expect things. So we are expecting after this public meeting to have the report out for you next week, and then to have the final report prepared for early January 2023. Next slide, please. This is the consultation touch points, which we did briefly go over already. I'll just speak to them because I just want to clarify how that information was used and contributed to the study at a high level, although Chris will go into more detail as he proceeds. The first is just initial stakeholder meeting feedback. So to identify data sources, potential research questions has been summarized and will be included in the report. And Chris was obviously there for that, so it informed his questions and ensured that, helped him to ensure that he had all the data that was available. There was past and ongoing correspondences that were provided to us, and all of those correspondences and data were reviewed and are used in reference throughout the research, including the report and Chris's presentation. And then the third is the public survey, which was used to corroborate background information, and there were photos that were provided that were reviewed by Chris to help complete his database and to corroborate his information as well. Next slide, please. With that, I'll hand it over to Chris, and then I'll touch bases again at the very end. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Beverly. All right, just to jump into the background of what our scope of work was. The goal of the Echo Lake causation study was to use the framework that we developed on our pilot program study at Peninsula Lake to explore the potential causes for the cyanobacteria bloom on Echo Lake that occurred in October of 2019. It was that's the only confirmed bloom on Echo Lake under the scope of our study. So that was where our data analysis focused, was on the potential causes and contributions to that bloom. Specifically, we use what we call a weight of evidence approach that considers multiple lines of evidence. So I'll describe that in more detail in a couple of slides. We compiled the existing information that is collected by the district, the Ministry of the Environment, weather station data nearby, a small field program that we did in fall of 2021, and the information that we gained from the stakeholder survey. So that was the questions that we asked on people's experience on the lake with algal blooms and their perceptions of the conditions leading up to those algal blooms, photos of active blooms where they were available. We also reviewed the other district relevant materials. So that would be, for example, there's a shoreline survey report where there's mapping done of the individual lots along the lake that give us an idea of the state of development on the lake. There's some development information on whether or not the development on the lake has changed over time or how it's changed over time. And so we looked at all of that as well. We assessed the phosphorus budget for the lake. So that's using the district's phosphorus model, the district's lake model, in order to see what the main sources of phosphorus to the lake are, and if those data have changed over time. So I looked at the updated development numbers to see whether or not the development numbers had changed, and if so, if that changed the phosphorus budget at all. And we also looked at doing an assessment of missing data. So that would be if we can't assign causation, or if we're not confident in the causation, what is the data that we're missing? So I'll cover all of those things. The weight of evidence approach was really looking at sort of three broad categories of information that are available in the monitoring data in the Muskoka region. One is the ecology of the algae itself. So Dolichospermum, which used to be called Anabina, is the particular genera of cyanobacteria that bloomed in 2019, and it has a very unique life cycle that I'll talk about throughout the course of the talk, and is detailed in quite a lot of detail within the report that will be circulated. I won't spend as much time on that as in my talk as I did in the report, but I'll talk about it where it's relevant. We looked at weather data, climate data from air temperatures, wind speed, which can be important in determining the physical characteristics of a lake, which can favor cyanobacteria. And we looked at long-term water quality data and development data to assess the cyanobacterial blooms in Eco Lake. Yeah, so the weight of evidence approach was hoping to find the most likely causes of the bloom. And the way that we did that was looking at across the top is the lines of evidence we looked at. So we looked at algal bloom history where it was available. Now that's limited since we only had a single bloom. We looked at historical water chemistry, we looked at climate history, and we looked at field data collection. And each one of those pieces of data fed into our assessments. So we looked for changes over time. We looked for whether or not there was a step change that would be like an abrupt increase in phosphorus that occurred immediately prior to the 2019 algae bloom. We looked at the phosphorus model, as I mentioned, and we looked at some of the other components, deep water oxygen status, potential for internal loading of phosphorus, and those sorts of things. And based on those categories, they fed into what we considered to be our most likely causes of the algal bloom. So whether or not it's being driven by the development in the watershed and changes in phosphorus that are resulting from that development, or whether or not it's being driven by physical changes in the lake that are being driven by meteorological variables. So here's that in table format, where each one of our lines of evidence that we're going to consider are a column in the table. So I'll take you through each item in the column. Some of them can't be assessed for every single lake. So this framework was developed for Peninsula Lake. Not every single line of evidence can necessarily be applied to each individual lake. So for Echo Lake, for example, an increase in bloom frequency would be what we would consider to be something that's happening where you've got infrequent blooms occurring in the past, and then suddenly in the more recent years, you're getting every single year blooms. So obviously that doesn't apply in this case because Echo Lake has a single documented bloom as of the time of our analysis. The location of the blooms were what we're looking for, and the location of the blooms is really if blooms are consistently occurring in the same place. That might suggest that there is a localized, point source that might be driving those blooms. Again, in the case of Echo Lake, we've got fairly limited information. I will look at that at the location of the bloom briefly, but we don't have multiple blooms, so we really only have the one bloom to work from, and similarly with the extent of the bloom. But looking at the bloom history, so the bloom on Echo Lake was confirmed by the MECP in October of 2019. The MECP sampled the lake on October the 9th. There was a reported bloom in 2020 while the study was underway, and that was reported to the MECP, and they sampled and found it to not be a bloom. So that is why that is not included in the study. It was an algal growth, but it was not confirmed as a bloom based upon the MECP's definition. To speak to the location of the bloom, based on survey results from the stakeholders that responded, we had, let me make sure I have the numbers exactly right here. We had responses from 23 contributors. Of the 23 contributors that did the survey, 13 of them answered the question on location of the bloom. And those results to me suggest that the bloom was a shoreline bloom that occurred around the majority of the lake, because the people's experience with the bloom tended to be determined by where they live. So people who said, I saw it in the south, tended to live in the south. So to me, that suggests that there was a larger bloom. It wasn't isolated to a single bay. It was throughout the lake, or it moved around the lake. If it blew from one place to another, unfortunately, we don't have specific enough information to discern that. So based on the information that I have to assume that it was a fairly lake-wide event. The extent, and then that goes to the extent of the bloom as well. The evidence that I have suggests a nearshore bloom. So some of the photos that I was sent, this is not all of them. I did look at all of them, but these are just two that I happen to pick out. So these pictures are both obviously in the nearshore. You can see that the algae doesn't obviously extend out very far beyond the shoreline. So this is fairly localized. It's fairly close to shore, but it is, based on the survey results, my understanding that there was many areas of shoreline that experienced similar conditions. So in terms of our check marks versus no check marks for those three items, we can't really assess bloom frequency. The location of the bloom being many shoreline areas does not suggest to us that there is a localized concern where the bloom began. Based on the evidence that we have, and so neither extent or location get check marks in this case. I'll look at the water chemistry and water quality evidence next, and then I'll jump back to the two climate-based pieces of information. So our field program goal was to sample in the fall in order to try and determine whether or not internal loading of phosphorus, so that's phosphorus being released from sediments, is a problem in the lake, or is something that is occurring in the lake. So when the water column stratifies as it warms up near the surface and stays cool down below, it separates into into distinct layers, and those distinct layers don't mix in lakes and temperate lakes in this region, and that causes that barrier to mixing causes several different things to happen. First of all, the water at the surface continues to warm even more and make that barrier stronger. But in the bottom water, where you've got bacteria decomposing organic matter and macrophytes dying potentially, and the decomposition of that organic matter, that consumes oxygen, and that consumption of oxygen drives the oxygen concentrations in the deep water down, and there's no oxygen from that top water being mixed in to replace it, and so you get depletion of oxygen, and depletion of oxygen to a certain level to what we call anoxia, where there's no oxygen left, can result in the release of phosphorus from sediments. So phosphorus is bound to the sediment, and when you get anoxic conditions, it can be released into the water column, and that can potentially be a source of phosphorus that's available to cyanobacteria and can cause bloom. So we wanted to explore if that was happening in Echo Lake for one, and as importantly, if based on the long-term record of dissolved oxygen concentrations in the lake, we could note that there was any change in the oxygen status of the deep water over time. We sampled at the blue point here, the teal point, which is the district's long-term sampling site. The orange dot on this map is the Lake Partner Program site. So I'll have data presented from both, assuming that this point is accurate in the GIS database that I was given from the Lake Partner Program. It does appear to be a more nearshore site, but the deep portion of the lake does extend around this bend, and so it is, by suspicion, is that it's just slightly offshore in the deep portion of the lake, probably offshore from the person who collects it. So our sampling season was aimed to target the end of the stratified season. We aimed to target the end of the stratified season because that gives the maximum amount of time for that oxygen depletion to take place. The longer the water column is stratified before it mixes in fall, the more opportunity there is for that oxygen to be depleted. So our goal was to get there as late as possible before mixing in order to see whether or not there was depleted oxygen in the lake. We collected, in addition to pH, conductivity, temperature, and dissolved oxygen profiles, we also collected water sample for general chemistry, nutrients, and metals. And if the oxygen was low in the lake, we had a potential sample to collect phosphorus and iron in the bottom waters, and that was to determine whether or not there is a substantial difference in the phosphorus concentration in that deep water relative to the water at the surface, which would give us an indication of how severe the internal loading in the lake was. Looking at the long-term dissolved oxygen profiles, historical records, the dissolved oxygen concentrations were consistently below 2 micrograms per liter during August sampling, and this would not have been necessarily the end of the stratified season. In many cases, 2019 was a bit of a weird result. I included it, but I'm suspicious of that particular data point, unless the lake just happened to mix early that year for some reason. But ignoring the 2019 point, the most of the almost every other year on record, we have depletion of oxygen in the deep water below the 2 microgram per liter threshold, which suggests to us that there is internal loading of phosphorus in this lake, but that since 1990, when the records began, there hasn't been any indication that it's any different. So there's nothing to explain why an algae bloom might have occurred in 2019, other than the fact that this is mixed. But again, I've got to look into this data to make sure that there's nothing there, but I'm suspicious of the data more than I am thinking that it's a likely cause of the algae bloom. So in terms of our lines of evidence, anoxia is something that we've definitely noted. Periodic anoxia is something that is occurring in the lake, but there is no documented change in anoxia that we believe is responsible for the 2019 cyanobacterial bloom that occurred in Echo Lake. So looking at some of the other lines of evidence in the next few slides, total phosphorus concentrations are something that we looked at. So we looked at the long-term District of Muskoka data that's at the top here, and we looked at the Lake Partner Program data that's being collected by stakeholders on the lake. And it's important to note that the methodology in the district's data collection changed in approximately 2002. So these data are included for completeness, but the fact that they're higher may have to do with some of the filtering practices that were put into place when the protocol changed. What both of these data sets show is that there's no long-term increase in phosphorus. There's no step change in phosphorus that is unique to 2019 that would suggest that bloom was the result of, let's say, like a shoreline disturbance or an increase in phosphorus driven by development. So to further explore total phosphorus concentrations, we looked at the phosphorus budget. It should say Echo Lake. I don't know why that didn't get updated. It should have been updated. We looked at the phosphorus budget for Echo Lake in order to try and determine what the sources of phosphorus to the lake were and what the relative contributions of phosphorus to the lake were. Overland runoff contributed an estimated 13.5%. So the contributions to the lake the categories that we break it down into are natural watershed and precipitation. So that would be what's coming in from the surrounding land and what's being rained down directly onto the lake. We looked at overland runoff. So that would be one of the potential avenues from development. So if you have cottage development and other residential developments on the lake, those developments, anytime you cut down trees, anytime you alter the land use and remove forest, you have potentially more runoff. You have impervious surfaces like driveways or lawns that result in more runoff from those areas. So those areas are estimated separately from the natural runoff that's occurring through the forest. So we have values for that runoff, and then we have potential septic system load as well. And those loads are based on loading from, based on the loading from the model based on numbers that were gathered in 1997 is the model numbers development data. But I looked at updating it based on district data, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So you can see that there's a significant portion of the load to Echo Lake that is been associated with septic systems, roughly 38%. It's important to note that the number that's associated with development in Echo Lake is the way that the model generates that number is based on, in the case of Echo Lake, is based on no attenuation. So that is all of the phosphorus that goes into the septic system and that's released by the septic system into the field inevitably makes it into the lake, depending on how far back the septic system is from the lake. And so it's almost a worst case scenario whereas the research that's been done on septic systems suggests that a functioning septic system will actually retain 70 to 90% of that phosphorus, depending on the system in place. So that number is sort of a worst case scenario number. I looked at, as I said, I looked at updating this number, but I actually found that the modern development numbers on the lake were lower than the ones that were included in the model. So there's been maybe some combination of lots or some elimination of existing lots that were on the lake. And so updating the model outputs with the new data would have actually resulted in a decrease in phosphorus and therefore wouldn't have informed the study. So that would suggest that development changes on the lake development on the lake has not significantly increased in the period of record that we have data for. So all that to say that we don't have a significant documented increase in total phosphorus or any other step change in phosphorus or changes in source phosphorus that suggest a significant, suggest that the development on the lake fed the 2019 algal blooms. So there's nothing in 2019 that was particularly different that we noted that would suggest that that bloom was caused by the development that is on the lake with the data that we have. So we looked at climate factors as well, which I'll get into in a minute. But before I do, we did have some water temperature data on the lake. The water temperature, warm water favors cyanobacteria at a certain threshold between 26 and 27 degrees, I think it is. Cyanobacteria are heavily favored over other algae species, other species or other genera like diatoms and chrysophytes and those sorts of groups of algae. Water temperature also results in stronger stratification and goes to the ecology that I mentioned about the algae earlier. So the ecological properties of those algae, they have gas vacuoles that allow them to move up and down in the water column and control their buoyancy. So they can stay in the light even when the water column is not mixing in order to keep them afloat, whereas the other algae groups rely on motion in the water to keep them up in that light zone. And when they fall out of the light zone, they die. So cyanobacteria have several mechanisms like that that allow them to outcompete other algae groups, and water temperature favors them highly. So we did see a marked increase in water temperature over the record over the course of our monitoring on the data, over the course of our monitoring on the lake, excuse me. The water temperature data that we have is from August and therefore cannot be directly related to the blooms, and that we don't have water temperature data immediately prior or to the bloom conditions. But it does suggest that warm water may have played a role in driving the recent bloom. Unfortunately, we don't actually have a specific 2019 point because the lake was not monitored in the year that bloom occurred. But we do have an overall trend, or not an overall trend, we do have an overall increase. So based on warm water and what we saw in the dissolved oxygen concentrations, we looked at trying to measure the internal load in the lake. So that is, what is the difference between the top phosphorus concentration and the bottom phosphorus concentration in the lake during that late fall sampling period. We took a top and bottom sample, and we found 24 micrograms per liter of phosphorus in the top sample and 3 micrograms per liter of phosphorus in the bottom sample, which was very surprising. And to me suggests that there was an issue, unfortunately, at the laboratory. So I know that the data was collected properly, but the results from the laboratory do not make sense. It does not make sense that the bottom water phosphorus concentration should be that low relative to the top. And so unfortunately, we weren't able to complete an assessment of how much internal load there might be because we didn't have a reliable bottom sample to work from. So we have a documented warm water, but we were unable to complete the measured internal load. We can surmise that there is an internal load in this lake based upon the low oxygen concentrations that are consistent throughout the record, but we weren't able to put a specific number to how much higher the phosphorus concentrations are in the deep water, unfortunately. Moving on to the last two lines of evidence, which are the climate-based evidence that we had available. So we looked to compare air temperature as a proxy for water temperature, because water temperature data was incomplete. So we would expect with warmer air temperature, we would likely also see warmer water temperature. And we know from the aconite germination, so that's the other biological component to this, and that is the cyanobacterial species, the Dolichospermum species, makes resting stages. Those resting stages are called aconites, and they sit in the sediment and wait for conditions to be appropriate before they are released and bloom into the water column. So that germination is triggered usually multiple weeks before the bloom occurs. And the triggers that are believed to lead to that germination of aconites is light, increasing light, changes in temperature, changes in nutrients, changes in dissolved oxygen, or a combination of those factors. Now, the specifics of that is still under investigation in the peer-reviewed literature. So we don't know specifically an actual degree Celsius threshold over which the temperature has to go, or a concentration or an amount of light. Those sorts of results are unfortunately not available. But what we were looking for was signs that there could potentially be those sorts of triggers occurring prior to the bloom. So to orient you on the graph on the right here, what I've got is the shaded box on the right side of the gray shaded box. That is the day that the bloom occurred. So on day 282, that's October the 9th. That's when the bloom was sampled. And I've highlighted a period several weeks before that, but you can extend that further as well, because that period of aconite germination is not well known exactly how long that takes, and it could vary because anything that's a biological process is often going to vary with time. What we found was there was a brief break in the data, but what we did see was that there was a very consistent elevated air temperature relative to the 10-year historical average prior to that 2019 algal bloom. Almost every single day prior to that 2019 algal bloom was above average conditions for air temperature, with a very few exceptions. And those sorts of elevated air temperatures can favor the blooming of cyanobacteria. So that gets a confirmation based on our assessment of that line of evidence. And we also looked at wind speed. And so the historical wind speed is another variable that can result. So calm waters can favor cyanobacteria because that creates even less mixing on the lake. Less mixing, as I mentioned earlier, results in non-motile algae that can't stay up in the water column, falling out of the water column, and can favor cyanobacteria. So one of the reasons for the delay on these studies was that we were hoping to get updated wind and climate data from the MECP. And unfortunately, that data wasn't able to be gathered, and we eventually had to go with an alternate data set. I've done some comparisons. I didn't put them in the presentation for the sake of keeping enough time for questions, but the MECP data was collected in Harp Lake near the water in a forested catchment, and that sort of wind speed data is much more likely to capture periods of calm because it's in a sheltered environment than something that's 100 meters away, in a flat open area above the lake. So we had to use this alternative data set, but what we found is that this data set does not do as good a job of capturing these distinct low periods that we've seen prior to algae blooms in other causation studies. And because there was only a single bloom in Echo Lake to use data from, we don't have any older blooms that we can use data from the MECP, because I do have previous MECP data, but I don't have anything from 2019 onwards. That being said, there is some low periods that you can see in the weeks leading up to the bloom. So from about mid-September to, from mid-September to about the third week of September, there is a week of very low wind speed followed by fairly average conditions leading up to the bloom. So there is some indication that there might have been calm, but it's certainly not as clear as it has been in some of the other studies. It is possible one mechanism that we've suggested for this bloom is that this period of calm could have resulted in the conditions for aconite germination, and then the subsequent windy periods that occurred following that you see in early October mixed those algae from the benthic environment into the water column, and that's what caused your bloom. So you have all of these algae in the shallow water around the rim of the lake, and they're on the sediment, and they're growing, and they're multiplying during this calm period, and then the wind mixes, and that's when you get them out into the water column in a bloom. So that's currently our theory for the likely cause of the 2019 algal bloom. And the climate conditions that we documented were supported by the survey results. So we looked at the survey results of people's observations leading up to the bloom. 6 people responded to that particular question directly, which was, what did you notice any periods of calm or warm prior to? And in all cases, I've put a couple of the quotes from various stakeholders that weighed in on that question here. But in all cases, it was confirmed that people felt that there was periods of calm and periods of extended warm weather leading up to the bloom, excuse me. So in both cases for climate, we get confirmations of what we would of what we were looking for, which was we did get a period of low wind prior to the bloom, and we did get warmer air prior to the bloom. So to summarize everything that we went through as part of the study, it's our belief that the 2019 cyanobacterial bloom was likely the result of weather factors, including both high air temperature and calm periods of wind, which created conditions that were favorable to cyanobacteria. The bloom was preceded by by both of those conditions based on the data we have, and the anecdotal evidence that we have from the people who lived on the lake during the bloom supports that. Dolichospermum resting stages may potentially absorb phosphorus from the sediment. That's something that's very well documented in a similar cyanobacteria, which is called Gliotrichia. The literature available on Dolichospermum aconites specifically is not as robust as it is for Gliotrichia, but they are very similar types of cyanobacteria that make very similar resting stages. So it is possible that it behaves in the same way. We can't say for certain, but it is a suspicion. And so what that would mean is that the phosphorus in the water column is not as important, which is another piece of evidence that I would suggest indicates that it's unlikely that development on the lake is what has driven the 2019 cyanobacteria bloom. So we have no evidence that total phosphorus changed, and no obvious links between development on the lake and the cyanobacterial bloom that occurred in 2019. One of the gaps that we've identified, and this is a regional gap as much as it is specific to the Echo Lake causation study, and that is the collection and documentation of algal blooms could be improved. So what we are looking to do is make sure everybody's aware of what kind of things to record and where to send them and who to report to. So that information is going to be included in the report, but I'm also hoping that we'll be able to develop a citizen science-based sort of bloom watch program where people will have the tools that they need in order to document cyanobacteria blooms when they occur, so that those blooms can be related to the conditions that are causing them more directly. Because in the case of say Echo Lake here on this one, it was pieced together by me from MECP emails and that kind of thing. But having, and I did have some pictures to work from, but having additional pictures from around the lake would have been beneficial, for example, or having it drawn out where specifically the bloom had occurred would have been very beneficial in terms of deciding whether or not there was point sources that needed to be investigated. Dolichospermum, as I mentioned, may draw phosphorus from the lake sediments, so that so an increase in sediment load could potentially feed those cyanobacteria. There's no good research available on whether or not there's a key concentration in the phosphorus at which that is more likely to occur or not. But generally speaking, reducing phosphorus in runoff, reducing phosphorus in stormwater is beneficial for the aquatic environment. And while it may not control these specific oligotrophic cyanobacterial blooms, There is potential with increased phosphorus to have blooms of more toxic type species. So both Dolichospermum and Gliotritia tend to be on the lower end of in terms of their production of toxins, and more nutrient load could result in blooming of something like Microcystis, where you've got more toxin per in the bloom that could be potentially more harmful. So for that reason, we do recommend that the stewardship measures that the district has put in place be continued, trying to improve shoreline buffers, reduce disturbance on the lake, limit use of fertilizer, not having lakes mowed straight up or lawns mowed straight up to the lake where that runoff has a direct path into the lake, as well as continued sampling through the existing programs. There hasn't been another bloom on Echo Lake since this initial one, so it is possible that that 2019 year just hit sort of a perfect storm of conditions, and whether or not those conditions are going to repeat is more likely to, in our opinion, to be driven by climate than by the development on the lake with the information we have available. With that, I'll pass back over to Beverly.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just going over next steps. At this point, I do acknowledge there's a couple questions that have come in, and I will pose those to Chris just after this, but I wanted to give you a heads up that right now we are finalizing the draft report. So the discussions that happen in this meeting will be summarized and included in that report. And we will be posting that 1 week from today, so that you have, on Engage Muskoka, and then that will be posted for comment for 2 weeks. So you'll be given the opportunity to provide comments on the draft report or any concerns that you have in writing. And then we'll compile those comments and provide a response to include in the final report. Just so everyone is aware, Michelle, I see your hand, so I will call on you in just a moment. But just so everyone is aware, unless there's comments that have substantial impacts on the report, it's likely that the responses to those comments are more likely to be in a table as an appendix, likely included in the consultation plan. However, if anything is submitted that needs to be addressed in the report itself, that will of course happen. So after that's completed, we will be doing January 9th. We'll be targeting for the final report to be completed on January 9th. And then from there, we will present that to the district. And then the next steps are essentially for the district to determine what they would like to do next. So that those reports will be presented to the community planning committee, and then there'll be a decision as to whether it needs to move forward to council for decision making. And with that, I'll open up to questions because it sounds like there are a few. So I will definitely allow that to happen first. Before you ask your question, Michelle, there were just a few that happened in the chat box that I want to address first, and then. Although it sounds like one of them is yours, so that's good. So maybe I'll just let you add on that then. So I think your question may have already been answered, but it was a question of what is done to confirm stakeholder information is accurate. For example, there are more blooms in locations that were not actual blooms. Maybe if you want to elaborate on that, and then it seems like you might have an additional question as well. So feel free to elaborate on that as well.
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, on behalf of the association and all our lake members, we appreciate, do you want me to get my video on?
Yeah, maybe it's easier. Sorry. I'll add that in.
I just saw the notice come up. There we go.
Yeah, no worries.
And I'll lower my hand there. And sorry, it's my work Zoom account.
Yeah, no worries. And actually, I should have mentioned this for anyone who asks a question. It's helpful for me if you just explain your interest. I think in your case, it's the association, but maybe just for the record, so that everyone knows sort of your interest in the lake and your role, and then we can proceed from there. Okay.
Sure. So, yeah, on behalf of the lake and the association, our members, we thank you for the report and making us part of the causation study. As you can imagine, a bloom on our lake is concerning, and we're really hoping, which I don't think we got, but we were really hoping to get information on what happened and how to prevent it. So, unless Mother Nature and us can have some sort of a discussion, I'm not sure most of the elements that were presented are things that are even within our control at this point. But one thing I was a little bit concerned about, and I expressed this in the first stakeholder meeting as well, is the survey that was sent out to lake members obviously was voluntary, but my concern is around how you confirm that information is accurate. So, one of the examples is people citing blooms in different areas of the lake, which were not verified as blooms, or there was comments about the water temperature going up. But yet when you look at the data we've been collecting ourselves on our own Echo Lake Association website, the lake temperatures, on balance haven't been increasing. So it seemed there was several times in the report where that information was used, in some cases selectively, like it was warm, 3 of the 6 respondents said, before the bloom happened. And it seems some of that data was used to support the findings versus maybe being taken objectively, or in some cases being looked at and saying, people don't know. I mean, I've been on enough email strings across the lake when these issues have come up where, people like to think that they know, but the reality is they don't. I mean, what you're basically getting are people's perceptions. And it's been documented, it's posted to the Echo, or to the Engage Muskoka site. It's now part of this study. So my concern is that it's maybe being given more weight than it should. So I'm just wondering what's being
I'll give a very high level about the overall engagement. So the intent of those surveys is to just understand what people understand, and Chris will talk about it as well, but to help corroborate, but not necessarily be the basis for all analysis. But I'll let him answer that in general. But in terms of the stakeholder engagement, the intent is to just make sure we're understanding perceptions and that's contributing to the research questions. So that's just the key component of that particular component part of it. But I'll let Chris answer to how that got incorporated into the actual study results.
Sure.
Okay. So the water temperature data that I included was collected by the district. So those data weren't submitted by stakeholders. Those data were collected by the District of Muskoka. So I trust that data was collected by the methodology that they use for their field program. The commentary information, the reason that I presented the commentary information at the end, so people's observations of the conditions leading up to the blooms, was because I wanted to present the data itself from the weather stations, and then just show that there is anecdotal information that suggests that what we're seeing in the weather data is what people are experiencing on the lake. So I feel that the data itself, just the data presented by itself, stands to sort of make that point, but I wanted to include the data that was being collected from the survey. So those data are not a concern. It is difficult to navigate the cyanobacterial bloom side of things. So where the blooms are located, where the blooms are not located, I have no means to corroborate that information. And the reason for that is because when the MECP is called to sample a bloom, they're usually called from an address, and they send an environmental officer, and that environmental officer will go and will sample the bloom at the address that they were called from. And they're not typically going to do multiple samples around the entire lake. They might make notes on where the bloom is at that time, but they're going to confirm whether or not there's a bloom or not. If a neighbor or somebody on the other side of the lake calls 2 days later and says, I'm noticing a bloom here, the majority of the time they're not going to send another environmental officer out to confirm that bloom. They're going to consider it a part of that same what they would call an ongoing case file. Basically, it's an open file. They're going to and particularly if they've already issued a warning for the lake and said, we've confirmed a bloom and we've warned people, to avoid these sorts of uses. if an active bloom investigation is ongoing, they don't usually open a second one. It's actually something that I've identified as potentially a problem, because you can have different blooms occurring at different times that are not necessarily the same bloom. So that's one of the things that I would like to get better at in terms of documenting blooms, but you really do need the people on the lake to be able to do that. Now, if people are delivering information that is unreliable, unfortunately, I can't parse out the reliable information from the unreliable information in this case, because what I've got is a confirmation of a bloom from the MECP with no detailed information on where it occurred, and then I'm relying on the information from the stakeholders in order to try and determine where that occurred. It's unlikely that a different scope of that bloom would have changed the outcome of the results, though, if I'm to be honest. It may have led us to investigate a specific location if that bloom was only occurring in one place. But the fact that there's no change in the nutrient concentrations in the lake at all, there's no increases or decreases associated with that 2019 bloom. There's, the phosphorus concentrations have been the same for such a long period of time. It's unlikely that we would have changed our conclusions based on, if the bloom was only occurring in one location, though it's unfortunate that is something that we have to contend with, unfortunately.
So my understanding is they actually took 3 samples when they were at the lake. We never see the actual report, but do you know if that's accurate?
I can confirm. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head. I'll confirm and get back to you.
Yeah. And again, obviously perceptions are important, but I just, I was concerned when we heard the survey was coming out and then saw it and completed it, that how that information is being used. So it sounds like there was some corroborating data that was used to present it as well. And then the other question is, most of what's causing this is not stuff we can control. Warmer weather, calmer waters. Are there going to be any recommendations that come out on what we can actually do, as lake members to improve it, or do we just kind of go with it really was a perfect storm and let's hope that doesn't happen again? Because that's the piece, like we'll communicate the education piece to our members, and it sounds like you're going to give us guidelines on when the next bloom happens, here's like 10 things we want you to look for or know. Like we'll obviously communicate all that out, but in terms of changing behavior or cautions or things like that, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of actionable directives we can give to our members.
Not for Dolichospermum blooms specifically. No, there's no evidence that there's lots of stewardship and management practices that can always be improved, that can help control things like macrophytes and can just generally make water quality better. But because of the nature of these algae, there's no strong information that suggests that it's going to prevent another potential bloom. The blooms that we've seen of similar species on most of the causation studies. So Peninsula Lake was a very similar outcome. Stewart Lake was a similar outcome. And 3 Mile Lake, where there's lots and lots of bloom data because they've had many, many lakes, has similar patterns as well. Though the phosphorus concentrations in 3 Mile Lake are quite a bit higher, there's really strong evidence there where we have a lot more data to work with, that it is really these periods of calm followed by a period of mixing that's bringing this benthic algae from the near shore into the lake. And it happens almost every single year in 3 Mile Lake. It doesn't happen that frequently in Echo Lake. So in terms of predicting if it's going to happen again or when it might happen again, I can't, but nor can I give you like a concrete activity that you can do that I can say will prevent it from occurring.
Okay. And then did you have access to, and it's not complete and returned to us yet, but from Watersheds with the Love Your Lake program and the analysis they did this summer, did you guys get a peek at that?
From this summer?
Yeah.
I don't think that was on our list, was it, Chris?
No. No,
No.
we had to cut off our data analysis at a certain point so that we could finish the study and bring it to a conclusion. So our cutoff would have been prior to anything that was done this summer.
I can just add to that, Michelle. We're just wrapping up the survey information, entering into the
Yeah.
computer now. So that information wouldn't have been available for this study. But
Okay.
what Chris was saying in terms of stewardship and what you were mentioning about trying to get the word out, good stewardship practices, all of that, the Levy Lake information will definitely feed into that and provide some resources for the association to help encourage those good stewardship practices.
Okay, great. Thanks. That was all I had.
Okay, Andrew, I see your hand is up. There was one question that happened during the presentation, so I just want to speak to that. So there were two questions actually from Cheryl. So the first is, to my knowledge, there's no longer any monitoring of septic systems on the lake, I assume. If the bloom was caused by development or a septic system, then what? And then the second question from her was also just wondering about annual sampling. It seems that the samples aren't taken when the bloom is already under investigation. I think I read that a report a year later wasn't followed up on because of that. Cheryl, I know you're on the call. If you want to provide additional context so that Chris can answer those questions, maybe that's the easiest. Yeah, and Chris, if you want to close the PowerPoint, we can do that as well.
Yeah, I can elaborate if there's any questions.
Just to clarify, so would you mind just saying your interest in the lake as well, so that we have that as well?
Sure. And I hope you don't mind if I stay off video because that was
Not at all. No worries at all.
I'm not ready.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Yeah, so I've been on the lake as a cottager since 1994, but we're living here full time since early 2020. So we're residents now.
Okay. Okay. And Chris, did you need any more elaboration on those two questions?
Yeah, can you repeat the questions?
Sure. The first one was, to my knowledge, there's no longer monitoring of our septic systems. If the blue were caused by development or a failed septic system, then what? And then the second is just wondering about annual sampling. It seems that samples are not taken when there's a bloom already under investigation. I think I read that in a report a year afterwards and wasn't followed up on because of that. I don't know the context of the second question, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll just pause the second question for a minute and address the septic system question. So the septic, if a septic system failed and that resulted in a bloom, my expectation would be that we would see a localized bloom rather than something that's happening around the lake. And the evidence that we have, and we've already discussed that the source of that information might be problematic, but putting that aside, the source of information we have on where the bloom occurred suggests that the bloom occurred along the shore of a large majority of the lake, because there was reports of it, multiple reports of it from different locations. So if we're to trust that information, then it would suggest to me that a local source, such as a failed septic system, is not likely the driver of the bloom that was documented by the MECP in 2019. And then the second question I wasn't clear on. I've heard it twice now.
Actually, I think it might be a little misunderstanding in the first question. Okay. So I understand that the results don't point to that. Mm-hmm. But what I'm wondering is, because there's no monitoring of at one time there used to be I don't know from what ministry or whatever used to come out and look at everybody's septics, and then there would be some mediation that the homeowner would have to do. They're not doing that anymore. So if in future there's a failure, nobody's necessarily going to know unless a bloom happens to result. And in the meantime, we're all drinking dirty water. But how would we police? So is that part of the recommendations? Would be to maybe bring back those septic inspections?
So our scope is to look at the causes of the bloom itself, if septic system inspections and septic system health is a concern of the Lake Association, then that is certainly something that can be explored. There's always the potential for a failure of a system or a leak from a system or something like that to make its way into the water. It would be quite localized if it were to occur. But you also can't monitor the entire near shore of the lake, so you can't monitor everywhere. So instituting a program where septic systems are regularly inspected in order to make sure that they're compliant and as a part of stewardship of the lake is certainly something that the Lake Association can look into in cooperation with the district. It's not something that I'm necessarily directly recommending because we don't have any reason based on the causation study to believe that that's a contributor to the bloom, and my recommendations need to be rooted in the science and in what we thought were the causation factors of the bloom. If that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And then Cheryl, your second question, the annual monitoring and something about not taking samples after a bloom happened. Did you want to clarify that? Because I'm not sure I'm understanding it either.
Yeah, if I recall from the presentation, there was another report of a bloom, but it was a year later, and it was still. But from what I understand, if I remember that slide correctly, it was still under the previous bloom report of 2019.
Nope, that's I see where the confusion is. So that bloom in 2020 was, yeah, it was a full year later. It was not related to the 2019 bloom. So the 2019 bloom is what triggered the causation study through the planning policy, and that's the one we have the data and the information on. There was an email in 2020 from a stakeholder to the MECP reporting what they thought might be an algae bloom. So that would have been the second algae bloom on the lake, second one in 2 years. It was sampled and it was determined not to be a bloom. So it's not related to the first one. It's just, I wanted to point out that there was a report because I was sent stakeholder information about that report. And I wanted to make sure everybody knew that I did read everything that I was sent from the stakeholders and incorporated it. But the reason I put that in there was just to say that the 2019 bloom is the only cyanobacterial bloom that's occurred on the lake that we have a record of. The 2019 report was not a bloom.
Does that answer your question, Cheryl?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Andrew, I see your hand has been up for a while, so I'll go to you now. Mind just explaining your interest in the lake, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thanks. Hey, I'm Andrew, and I'm a cottager on the lake. Thank you for your work here. Really appreciate it. I know I speak for a lot of my fellow cottagers when I say that. I also wanted to thank Michelle for her leadership on this really important issue. And I actually wanted to build on Michelle's question about actions. I appreciate this may be out of scope, but I'm going to ask it anyways. And hope you can at least give us some general guidance. Echo Lake seems particularly vulnerable to climate change, given its relatively small size and shallow depth. So I sort of fear that this is maybe just the beginning of blooms and other sort of climate related impacts. And so I was curious to know if there are other best practices beyond the recommendations that you shared that we should be considering to not just avoid blooms, but more broadly, help ensure that the lake continues to thrive as the world continues to warm?
It's a good question. And certainly shoreline management and stewardship practices and buffers is probably the most direct thing. And I hate to keep coming back to it, but it is because I know that it's something I don't hate to come back to it. It's important, but it's something that's been ongoing in Muskoka, and it's something that the district has championed for a lot of years now. But the shoreline reports that have been done in the last 5 years still suggest that there's a lot of room for improvement on all of the lakes that we've done causation studies on. There's still lawns mowed straight to a beach or straight to the water. There's retaining walls that reflect wave energy back and can resuspend sediments and result in loading of phosphorus to the lake. So to be very clear, that would not necessarily help with preventative climate change measures. Unfortunately, you're right. A small lake, a warming climate, the water is going to warm. That's going to lead to physical changes in the lake that are unavoidable without aggressive in-lake active management, which most active management processes that would do that sort of thing are not approved for use in Canada. That's the sort of thing that they do to manage lakes more aggressively in the US and in other jurisdictions. We're not allowed to do that here. It's much more focused in Canada on managing the watersheds, managing the land around the lake as best we can. And that does not directly address climate change and warming properties. That being said, controlling phosphorus coming into the lake can have benefits for improved shoreline environments, keeping macrophyte growth under control, creating habitat for fish that make recreational enjoyment of the lake more possible. So there is definitely stewardship that can be done, but stewardship that can be done that will directly combat climate change is unfortunately not necessarily something I can give you.
Thank you. And I guess just to build on that, do you think we have at least the sufficient monitoring in place to be aware and sort of send up an early warning signal for these changes as they're happening?
I know that the district is looking at alterations to their monitoring program, and I don't want to speak out of turn in terms of what their long-term plans are for that, because I know it's ongoing, and I know that they're looking at options right now, and there are other projects not related to the causation study that are being done in terms of how integrated watershed management and general monitoring in the Muskoka River watershed can be improved. There's always room for improvement, but there's always cost associated with those improvements. So right now, in terms of tracking nutrient concentrations in a large number of lakes, I think the district is doing a really good job at collecting that information, and there's a lot of lakes to collect information on. So that obviously limits what you can do on any given lake. If the Lake Association wanted to get engaged with collecting more data, I would look at talking with the Lake Partner Program and seeing whether or not you could add samples. There's already a Lake Partner Program site on the lake, but if you wanted to say we would like to include a sample from this basin to see whether or not it's any different, the South Basin, for example, they might be willing to take an extra sample from the lake in order to expand the amount of water quality information that's available on the lake. But other than that, the sort of changes to the program need to come gradually over time. So.
Chris, I wonder if, I know in the previous presentations we had talked about your suggestions for monitoring blooms as they happen or perceived blooms. Maybe this could also relate, or his question could relate to that topic as well. Because I know you're thinking about recommending it, sort of for the entire district. So
so that is certainly something that we're looking to improve and centralize, is monitoring of blooms as they occur, in order to try and get a better idea of what the drivers of those blooms are. So that's and it speaks to something we talked about earlier, which is the difficulty in relying on anecdotal information of where blooms are occurring. So if people on the lake are able to not only report to the MECP, but also record their own observations, and by that I mean take photos of a bloom, so that we have a photo which would then have a timestamp and an address of the person who took it, then we would have an indication of where these blooms are occurring, how big they are, what the scope of them is, and that information can be related to other variables in order to, if there's need to look at cause in the future. Though at this stage, I do strongly believe that it's the weather that is driving the blooms in most of these lakes, not in every single one, but in most of these lakes.
Does that answer your question, Andrew?
It does. Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. There was a question in the chat box, which I understand the district will be answering directly. So the question was from Michelle, which says, what actions will the district be considering with the presentation of this report? I'll leave that to Elizabeth, and then if you need me to add anything, let me know. Okay.
Thanks, Beverly. So as you're aware, we're undertaking, or our consultants are undertaking, a total of 5 causation studies at the moment on not only Echo Lake, but 4 others across Muskoka that were identified a couple years ago as sort of a guinea pig for running these causation studies to see if there's any trends amongst all these lakes and that kind of thing, to better inform our policies on our vulnerable lake policies and how we approach the undertaking of causation studies. Our policies right now state that every lake that experiences an algae bloom needs a causation study if it ever wants to be removed from our vulnerable lake list. Even if it's one bloom in 20 years, it stays on there unless it can be absolutely cleared off the list for a variety of different reasons. So the first step is to have the 5 causation studies completed and look at what the consultants determine on all 5 lakes as the reasons, the causes, and see if there's trends, see if there's similarities that despite geographical differences, lake characteristic differences, contextual differences are similar, to hopefully better inform our enhanced protection policies that are in our official plan that are applied to new development, and also our causation study policies to make sure we're making the most out of district funds when it comes to undertaking causation studies. Right now, I think there's over 20 lakes that are on our vulnerable lake list, and we just want to make sure from a corporate perspective that we're using taxpayer dollars the most efficiently, instead of just doing studies because our policy says we need to do studies, or if we can better direct the efforts into something that actually will make a difference. So the first step is to have all of the 5 reports completed, and the consultants work through all the comments that come in. We're still going through them as well to fully understand them, and a bunch of different people at the district are reviewing them based on their varied expertise. So we're in the process of doing that. And once that's complete, essentially we're looking at presenting the 5 studies to our counselors at committee for their review, and so that they understand what's going on with this project. And if there are trends, or there are recommendations that come out of these reports that can be implemented in policy, that's sort of the next step, is to open up our policies to make sure what we're implementing and what is applicable to lakes that are experiencing algae blooms is the most effective at managing those lakes from a planning policy perspective. So Rebecca's group does really valuable water quality testing, and we have really good resources dating all that historical data for that component of it. But when it comes to development, if there's anything that we can do from a policy perspective to make sure that even if it's not necessarily septics are the reason why there's algae blooms happening, but if there's still measures that we can make sure implemented that will mitigate the human side of things, I guess, even if it is climate change, that's the driving factor or something like that. So long story short is that we're going to be getting the reports finished up by the consultants, and kind of from there map out a path for what happens to our policies. So it might be that the consultants believe that what we have going is great and we should continue on that path. Maybe there's some minor alterations, or maybe there's large alterations. At this point, we're not entirely sure, but it will all be a transparent process in front of committee, anything that does happen. So and we'll be using the Engage page often to notify all the stakeholders as well. So once we know, we will let everyone else know. But until then, we're kind of still in that, like we're getting the information almost in real time as all the stakeholders are. So we're still in the absorption process and trying to figure it out from our end of what it all means for us. So that was a really long-winded response. I apologize.
And I'm just wondering, Michelle, if some of your questions were also about monitoring, or is it specific to policy changes that your question was related to?
Well, either, because
Okay.
at the end of Chris's presentation, he said, there's a couple of things we can do. And then it was noted this would go back to the district to consider. But to me, there wasn't a whole lot of concrete recommendations in there for the district to consider. So understanding it goes beyond just what's in this report to the other policies, that makes sense. And then how do we get off the vulnerable lake list? I mean, it seems like it's a pretty elite crew of 20, but we don't want to be there. So, the causation is not being pinpointed to something necessarily that we could control. We haven't had another bloom, but how is this like our eventual demise? Is this just where we live the rest of our days? Or, if there's no other activity in 5 years, you come off the list because we now have had the causation study. Is there anything we can do for that?
You want to answer that? I mean, I think you remove them after the causation studies are complete. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm just trying to look up what the actual wording is in our official plan. But of course, my official plan is frozen. So give me 1 second.
Okay.
Right now we do have explicit policies on how you get off the vulnerable lake list. So I just want to make sure I'm referencing the right policies.
Okay. Well, and it doesn't afford us any benefit, right? I mean, we don't get any extra testing or any extra attention.
I mean, yeah, like our enhanced protection policies are really geared towards new development. And so I don't know if there's going to be, recommendations from the consultants with respect to existing development. I know that most of them have encouraged, the revegetation of clear-cut shorelines, if that's applicable on the 5 lakes. I know the septic reinspection program was brought up earlier. So I believe in 2020, there were a couple of reports that were taken to committees at the district level, essentially from a perspective of encouraging collaboration with the lower tiers who would, it would be their choice to have a septic reinspection program. So I believe potentially in Muskoka, only Muskoka Lakes has one right now, or they were at least proposing one this year, and putting a policy in place. So that would definitely be a valuable topic of outreach to the township to see if there's any appetite to do that, because it is ultimately through like the building department that they would do septic re-inspections, but it is definitely something worth a discussion perhaps. Yeah, I guess if you want, the policy.
We did that with Lake Base Township.
I'll let her look up the official plan policy, but I just wanted to answer that quickly. So this was primarily a scientific study. So the policy piece is the district, but we have made ourselves available to answer questions, to discuss the best mechanisms for implementation. So that's an ongoing discussion, I guess, is the point. And the answer to that isn't necessarily known at the moment, but it sounds like Rebecca also wants to answer that question just about monitoring. And so I'll let her answer that too.
So Michelle, Schedule E2 lakes do get enhanced monitoring. Typically we monitor lakes either on a 2 or 3 year rotation, and the lakes that are classified as vulnerable get monitored annually. So that is one benefit, if you will, of being on that list. We also do carry out benthic monitoring on the lakes. Typically, we only do it in association with the Lake Association for collecting some of that data. But the lakes that are considered vulnerable, we make an extra effort to sample those lakes annually as well, regardless of whether there's an association that's interested. So there is some enhanced monitoring that does go on, and you're also kind of first in line for special projects. So for instance, Love Your Lake program, right? Like we approached you to see if you want to do that. And we did that because you were on that list. So there are some advantages to being on that list. But of course, it would be nice not to be on the list at all. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
And so to get off the vulnerable lake list, it would be that the water quality indicators, so a blue-green algae bloom is one of the water quality indicators, wouldn't be present for 3 consecutive years, and that a causation study deemed it not development related. So it's those two. So as long as you haven't had a bloom in 3 years and the causation study, it's not development related, the lake can come off the vulnerable lake list.
So we have actually met those criteria then, because we were October 2019. We're not environmental, and we had the causation study.
Once it's finalized, yeah. So then the next
Okay.
steps might include removing you from the list, and that discussion would happen after the completion of the studies.
Okay, yeah, and we did ask the township about septic monitoring. I'd have to look up the answer, but basically I was told they're not doing it, and they referred us to a private company if we wanted to do that. So, but it's interesting for us because we've had 2 Princess Margaret properties on our lake. So clearly from the permit perspective, being a vulnerable lake didn't do anything there because we still allowed, 2 new builds to come into the lake and clearing in some cases right down to the shoreline, which was a little disappointing given our current state. But that's where we would expect the district to perhaps step up and take some stronger action. And that's not actually what we've seen. So
I would say just in terms of, new developments and any sort of law, like lot alteration, like clear cutting and whatnot, their development permit bylaw is quite strict, I believe, on shoreline buffers. So maybe worth, as the Lake Association, a call to the planning department to discuss.
We had to call bylaw on one of them because runoff was going right into the lake. And I mean, I can appreciate the newer septic systems are much better than some of the older systems. That's not the concern as much, but they're coming in with a very different mentality for sure. So, okay, that's great.
So,
yes,
and
you can't have
I mean,
an unobstructed view to the shore, to the water, right? You need to be able to see the water everywhere from all angles.
Well, and between that and the builder, they all knew better, and it was rectified pretty quickly after the call to bylaw. But it was sad that we had to actually make the call.
Yes, there's lots of discussions to be had about new vegetation. Like once established, old vegetation's gone. It takes replanting is not the same, and
yeah, and I'll say, like, the recommendations do have recommendations for enhancing shorelines, and so discussions on policy implications, etc. But it sounds like mostly you have an enforcement, or it's more of an enforcement issue than it is a policy issue in that particular case. So, yeah, those are probably more specific to how to approach it if something like that were to occur. But at least awareness of what the rules are locally tends to help, because then at least people are paying attention and know who to report it to if something were to occur. Sorry, Andrew, I did see your name. Did that answer all of your questions, Michelle? Yes? Okay, perfect. So Andrew, I saw your hand was up, so I'll hand it off to you again. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on the question around being removed from the list. Assuming we are removed from the list, is there a way for the lake to continue to receive enhanced monitoring?
I think that's a Rebecca question.
So we do continue it on for a little bit. It's not like you're not going to be booted off right away, but we certainly do encourage the association to participate in programs like the Lake Partner Program, and that way even when we do move to a 2-year rotation, if that's what happens, you're still collecting data annually, and we can use that data to sort of corroborate the information that we're collecting, and it helps to fill in gaps, especially because we know how that data is also collected and analyzed, and it's done at the same lab as we get our samples analyzed at. So we strongly encourage all associations to participate in the Lake Partner Program. There's also a lot of other volunteer citizen science programs that can be participated in, and we certainly encourage associations to do that. So some of it will come down to how active the association wants to be and helping to collect this data, and we are certainly willing to continue working with the association. So it's not going to be we're not going to cut you off like ASAP if it is, and honestly, to be delisted is probably going to be a bit of a process, because we get the results from these, as Elizabeth's saying, we get the results, and then that goes to committee and gets approved, and then the planners will take a report to committee later on saying, these are the changes we're recommending for Schedule E2, and then that goes through the whole process and so on. So it will still be a little bit away, but yeah, I mean, we're happy to continue trying to work with associations as much as possible. We are a little bit limited by resources, right? Like we only have so many people to do a huge number of lakes. So as resources allow, we'll continue to support. I'll say that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think that's what I was sort of driving at. Given your limited resources, is there an avenue where the lake sort of pays for the continued enhanced monitoring itself, or is that something that's possible? Or
not through us, but certainly, like Lake Partner Program is free, right? You don't need to pay to do it. You could if you wanted to implement your own sort of monitoring program, but I really think that's maybe not necessary, right? Like there's enough other great programs out there that if you guys are willing, then I think you guys should get more involved in some of those. And
great, thank you.
Collect your own data. Yeah.
I would say, just very briefly to add to that one avenue, I can't speak for them obviously, that you might consider pursuing if you want to do additional monitoring. The Lake of Bays Association, that's very near you, has a citizen-driven large-scale monitoring program where they monitor, I believe it's between 11 and 15 sites on Lake of Bays, and they collect data every single year. And I do a report for them at the end of every year to summarize that data and to look for changes over time. I don't know if they have any interest in expanding their program the way that the Muskoka Lakes Association has beyond their own borders, but they would be the first people that I would suggest you call, other than doing the Lake Partner Program, as was mentioned by Rebecca.
Thanks for the tip, super helpful.
Okay, I think I'll open it up one more time for questions, just make sure there's nothing lasting or anything and end off with. And if not, again, keep in mind that you're welcome to email Cassie with any additional comments or thoughts that you have after this meeting. And additionally, that the draft report will be posted on the Engage Muskoka site. And so you will be given the opportunity to provide comments for a period of 2 weeks as well. Will be posted 1 week from today. So please provide your comments. We will be reviewing and responding to all of them. And with that, since I don't see any additional comments, I'll hand it off to Cassie to close the meeting.
Thanks, Beverly, and thank you, Chris, for the presentation. I think I can speak for everyone on the line here that we certainly learned a lot this afternoon about the lake, and we look forward to diving into the draft report. Thanks to you all for joining us this afternoon for a great discussion, all your questions and your effort and interest throughout this entire project. So we look forward to your comments and certainly towards the final report. So thanks again. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.